Chapter 1. The House That Waited. The Turner car rattled over the uneven gravel road, its tires crunching the stones with a rhythmic, almost deliberate sound. Daniel glanced briefly at the rearview mirror. Eleanor sat silently in the back seat, her face pale and expressionless, her gaze fixed on the fogged window as if trying to see something far beyond the dense forest that hemmed them in. The silence between them was heavy, oppressive even, like the weight of a storm before it breaks. The house revealed itself suddenly, rising like a forgotten relic from the dense trees. It was a sprawling Victorian structure, its once bright paint now faded to a sullen gray, and its windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to watch them with a patient kind of malice. The wind stirred the overgrown weeds in the front yard, and the branches of a gnarled oak tree scraped against the roof like skeletal fingers. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the chilly air. "Here we are," he murmured, though the words felt hollow, even to him. He stepped out of the car and stretched, glancing back at Eleanor. She remained motionless, her fingers clenched tightly around the strap of her backpack. The house loomed over them as they approached, its warped wooden steps creaking under their feet. The front door opened with a groan, revealing a dim, musty interior. Dust motes swirled in the weak light streaming through the windows. The air inside smelled of decay and something faintly metallic, a scent that prickled the back of Daniel's throat. Eleanor followed her father inside, her footsteps eerily quiet on the scuffed floorboards. She paused in the doorway, her eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the room. It was as if the house were waiting, watching, to see who had dared to enter. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking and awkward attempts at normalcy. Daniel busied himself fixing leaky faucets and repairing loose banisters, doing his best to make the house livable. Eleanor, however, seemed to retreat further into herself. She spent hours wandering the halls, her footsteps echoing softly against the high ceilings. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in a dull, amber glow, Eleanor stopped at a door at the end of the upstairs hallway. The wood was darker than the others, its surface carved with faint, intricate patterns that seemed to shift under the fading light. A sense of unease prickled at her skin, but she couldn't look away. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface. The door didn't budge, but Eleanor could have sworn she heard something. Faint whispers, soft and indistinct, like voices speaking from the other side of a vast, echoing canyon. She stepped back, her heart pounding, and turned to see her father standing at the top of the stairs. "You okay, Ellie?" Daniel asked, his voice tired and strained. She nodded mutely and hurried past him, her footsteps quick and uneven. That night, the house seemed to come alive. The wind howled through the broken eaves, and the walls creaked and groaned as if something immense was shifting within them. Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her body tense under the thin blanket. She could hear it again. The faint whispers, closer now, threading through the darkness like a cold breath against her ear. The morning brought little comfort. The house felt different, heavier, as if it had drawn its first real breath after years of dormancy. Eleanor wandered into the backyard, where a neglected garden sprawled like a chaotic labyrinth. Among the overgrown bushes and wildflowers, she found a small stone marker, half buried in the soil. The engraved name was illegible, worn away by time, but a chill ran down her spine as she touched its rough surface. She didn't tell her father about the marker or the whispers. Some part of her knew he wouldn't understand. Or perhaps it was that the house didn't want her to. Days turned into weeks, and the house's presence grew more insistent. Eleanor began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. She avoided mirrors, claiming she didn't like the way her reflection looked back at her. She spoke less, her words clipped and distant, and her once bright eyes darkened, their gaze sharp and cold. Daniel, preoccupied with his own grief, noticed but dismissed these changes. "She's just adjusting," he told himself. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And the house waited, patient and hungry, for the moment it could claim her completely. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Floorboards. The early morning light seeped through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, painting the dusty floorboards in thin, pale stripes. The house was quiet, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind that hummed beneath the surface, alive with tension. Daniel had left for town, mumbling something about groceries and errands. Eleanor was alone. The solitude should have felt comforting, but the house wrapped around her like a damp, suffocating shroud. It seemed to breathe in her presence, its creaks and groans punctuating the oppressive stillness. Eleanor wandered through the narrow hallways, her fingers brushing against the faded wallpaper, the floral patterns discolored and peeling away like skin. In the kitchen, she found a small hatch in the floor that she hadn't noticed before. The edges of the wood were splintered, the latch rusted and worn. Something about it drew her closer, an almost magnetic pull that made her chest tighten. She crouched down, pressing her ear to the cold wood, and then she heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers. They were low and guttural, like voices speaking a language she couldn't understand. Her breath hitched as she pressed her ear harder against the floor, straining to make sense of the sounds. The whispers grew louder, sharper, until they seemed to be just beneath her, mere inches away. Her fingers hovered over the latch. She didn't know why she wanted to open it, why she needed to open it, but the compulsion was overwhelming. Just as she began to lift the rusted handle, the front door slammed shut, and she jumped back, her heart hammering in her chest. Daniel's voice called out from the hallway, breaking the spell. "Ellie? I'm back." Eleanor scrambled to her feet, her face pale and her hands trembling. She glanced back at the hatch, its secret still hidden, before rushing to meet her father. As the day wore on, the house seemed to retreat into itself, its earlier intensity dulling into a quiet, watchful state. Daniel spent the afternoon unpacking boxes in the living room, while Eleanor retreated to her bedroom. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window at the overgrown garden. The stone marker she'd found days ago lingered in her mind, its worn surface etched into her memory. Her gaze drifted to the attic door in the corner of her room. Like the hatch in the kitchen, it seemed to call to her, a silent but insistent invitation. She'd never gone up there before. Daniel had warned her the stairs were rickety and unsafe. But now, she found herself standing beneath it, her fingers curling around the frayed rope of the pull-down ladder. The attic unfolded before her like a forgotten tomb. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the weak light from a single, grimy window. Boxes and old furniture were piled haphazardly, their outlines shrouded in shadow. Eleanor hesitated at the top of the ladder, her stomach twisting with unease. As she stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under her weight, and the whispers returned, softer this time, as if they were testing her resolve. They seemed to emanate from a cracked mirror propped against the far wall. The glass was cloudy and streaked, but as Eleanor drew closer, she saw something moving within its depths. Her reflection was wrong. The face staring back at her wasn't hers. It was sharper, crueler, with eyes that burned like embers. The figure's lips moved soundlessly, forming words Eleanor couldn't hear but could feel in the pit of her stomach. She stumbled back, her foot catching on a loose board. The impact jarred something loose. Beneath the mirror, a small leather-bound book tumbled to the floor, its brittle pages yellowed with age. Eleanor knelt to pick it up, her fingers brushing against the cover. The whispers surged, louder and more insistent, as if urging her to open it. The book was filled with symbols and sketches, their meanings indecipherable but haunting. There were drawings of the house, or at least a house that looked eerily similar, along with strange figures standing in its windows, their faces featureless and hollow. Eleanor's fingers traced the lines of a particularly detailed sketch. A girl standing at the center of a circle, her arms outstretched as shadows twisted around her like living things. The whispers seemed to swell, filling the attic until they pressed against her skull, demanding to be heard. She slammed the book shut, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers receded, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She shoved the book under her bed later that night, unwilling to keep it in sight but unable to bring herself to throw it away. Over the next few days, Eleanor's behavior grew stranger. She spent hours locked in her room, the faint sound of rustling pages leaking through the door. She stopped eating meals with Daniel, her appetite waning until her already slight frame grew gaunt. Her eyes, once vibrant and full of curiosity, became dark and hollow, their gaze unnerving. Daniel tried to reach her, his worry growing with each passing day. "Ellie," he said one evening as they sat in the dimly lit kitchen, "are you feeling okay? You've been distant." She didn't respond, her focus fixed on her hands as they traced invisible patterns on the table. That night, Daniel woke to the sound of footsteps creaking across the floorboards. He sat up, his heart pounding, and listened. The sound wasn't random. It was purposeful, moving slowly and methodically through the house. He found Eleanor standing in the kitchen, her eyes closed and her hands outstretched as if feeling for something in the dark. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't hear. When he called out to her, she didn't respond. It was only when he touched her shoulder that she jolted awake, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You were sleepwalking," he said, his voice tight with unease. "Come on, let's get you back to bed." But as he led her upstairs, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been watching them, that it had been waiting for this moment, for the first crack to appear in whatever fragile normalcy they had left. And beneath the floorboards, the whispers continued, growing bolder, as if they knew their time was near. Chapter 3. A Mother's Shadow. The morning sun failed to pierce the heavy clouds that gathered over the house, leaving the rooms bathed in a dim, ashen glow. It was the kind of light that felt less like daybreak and more like the twilight of a forgotten world. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the small leather-bound book she had pulled from the attic. The symbols inside seemed to shift the longer she looked at them, their sharp lines and spirals blurring together like smoke. Her fingers hovered over the pages, tracing a particularly jagged design. It looked like a doorway, arched and jagged, surrounded by figures whose faces were lost to the erosion of time. Beneath it were words in a script she couldn't read but felt she somehow understood. She could hear the whispers again, faint and fleeting, like the echo of something just out of reach. They urged her forward, though she couldn't explain how she knew this. It was a pull she couldn't ignore, an invisible thread wrapping tighter around her each day. Eleanor's father was downstairs, muttering curses as he fiddled with the ancient plumbing. The clanking of pipes and occasional groans of frustration filled the air, but it did little to drown out the weighty silence of the house. It was in that silence that she heard it, the unmistakable sound of humming. The melody was soft and mournful, drifting through the house like the remnants of a dream. Eleanor froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was faint but achingly familiar. It was her mother's. Her mother had always hummed when she cooked, when she folded laundry, when she sat by Eleanor's bedside to chase away nightmares. The sound now was identical, yet impossibly distant, like a recording warped by age. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The humming didn't stop, but it didn't grow louder either. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding her like a shroud. Eleanor followed the sound through the winding hallways of the house, her bare feet padding softly on the cold floorboards. The walls seemed closer than before, their faded wallpaper curling like the edges of old parchment. The air grew heavier with each step, carrying the faint scent of lilies, her mother's favorite flower. The humming led her to a room she hadn't entered before. It was small, tucked away in the far corner of the house, its door slightly ajar. She pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was bare except for a single rocking chair placed in the center. The chair was old, its wood splintered, and its cushion faded to a dull gray. It swayed gently back and forth, though there was no breeze to move it. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. The humming was louder now, emanating from the chair itself. She took a hesitant step forward, her eyes fixed on the empty seat. As she approached, the whispers began again, threading through the melody like a dark undertone. They were stronger this time, more distinct, their guttural tones clashing with the soft hum. Eleanor reached out, her fingers brushing against the worn wood of the chair. The moment her skin made contact, the humming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, pressing against her ears like a scream. The chair stilled, its gentle rocking ceasing as if startled. Eleanor pulled her hand back, her heart racing. But the room was now empty of sound or movement. She backed away, her steps unsteady, and ran from the room without looking back. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each detail sharper and more haunting than before. She couldn't shake the feeling that the chair had been waiting for her, its presence deliberate and knowing. The scent of lilies lingered in the air, faint but persistent. She turned onto her side, clutching the blanket tightly, but sleep refused to come. Hours passed before she finally drifted off, only to be pulled into a dream that felt too vivid to be imaginary. She was back in the small room, standing before the rocking chair. This time, the chair was occupied. Her mother sat there, her face obscured by shadow, her head bowed as she hummed the same mournful melody. "Mom?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Her mother didn't respond, but the humming stopped. Slowly, she raised her head, and Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Her mother's face was wrong, stretched and distorted, her eyes hollow and filled with a sickly yellow glow. "You left me," the figure rasped, its voice layered with something dark and inhuman. Eleanor stumbled back, her legs weak and trembling. "I didn't. I couldn't. You left me here," the figure repeated, rising from the chair. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if controlled by invisible strings. "Now it's your turn to stay." Eleanor woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat and her throat raw from a scream she hadn't realized she'd made. The next morning, Daniel noticed the bags under her eyes and the pallor of her skin. "Ellie, are you okay? You look exhausted." "I'm fine," she lied, her voice hollow. But she wasn't fine. The whispers were louder now, constant and insistent, filling her mind even when the house was silent. The scent of lilies followed her wherever she went, clinging to her like a second skin. And in the corner of her vision, she swore she could see a figure standing just beyond the shadows, its presence cold and unyielding. The house wasn't just watching her anymore. It was reaching for her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. And Eleanor, despite the fear that clawed at her chest, couldn't stop herself from reaching back. Chapter 4. The Mark on Her Skin. The rain came down in a relentless sheet, hammering against the roof and streaking the grimy windows of the house. The sound was deafening, a constant roar that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the structure. Inside, the air was thick and damp, carrying the faint, metallic tang that had become so familiar to Eleanor in recent weeks. She sat in the hallway, her back pressed against the wall, staring at the door to her bedroom. The leather-bound book sat on the floor in front of her, open to a page she hadn't noticed before. The illustration was vivid and grotesque. A cracked mirror with dark tendrils snaking out of it, wrapping around the figure of a girl. The girl's face was blank, her eyes and mouth voids of endless black. Eleanor didn't remember turning to this page, but it felt as though the book had wanted her to see it. She traced the edges of the drawing with her fingertips, her nails scraping lightly against the paper. The whispers began again, soft and coaxing, threading through the pounding rain like a secret just for her. She snapped the book shut and stood, her movements stiff and jerky. The compulsion that had been building within her since the first day in the house was unbearable now, a gnawing need she couldn't suppress. Her gaze drifted toward the mirror in the upstairs bathroom. The mirror had always been there, an unassuming rectangle of glass framed in tarnished silver. It was the kind of object you wouldn't think twice about, ordinary, forgettable. But now, Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about it. She made her way down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The door to the bathroom was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open with trembling fingers. The mirror greeted her with its cold, indifferent reflection. At first, she saw only herself, a pale, tired girl with hollow eyes and unkempt hair. But as she stared, her reflection began to change. The edges of her face seemed to blur, her features stretching and twisting into something unrecognizable. Her eyes darkened, filling with the same sickly yellow glow she had seen in her dream. Eleanor. The voice came from the mirror, low and rasping, like the scrape of metal on stone. Her reflection's lips moved, forming the word, but the sound seemed to come from all around her. She stumbled back, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder, merging with the voice until it was a cacophony of noise that drowned out even the pounding rain. Eleanor, the mirror repeated. Come closer. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her toward the glass. The closer she got, the more distorted her reflection became. The girl in the mirror wasn't her anymore. It was a stranger with 2 long limbs and a face that seemed to shift and ripple like water. You're not real, Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking. The reflection smiled, its teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. I am what you will be, it replied. The glass began to crack, thin lines spidering out from the center. Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling, and pressed her palm against the surface. The coldness of the glass bit into her skin, and the cracks deepened, spreading outward until the mirror was a web of jagged lines. And then it shattered. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the house, followed by a silence so profound it was suffocating. Eleanor stumbled back, her hand bleeding from the shards that had rained down onto the floor. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. She looked down at her hand, the blood pooling in her palm and dripping onto the floorboards. But as she stared, the blood began to move. It slithered across her skin like a living thing, forming symbols she recognized from the book. Panic surged through her, and she wiped her hand on her shirt, smearing the blood but failing to erase the marks. Her breathing came in shallow gasps as she stumbled out of the bathroom, her footsteps leaving crimson smudges in her wake. Daniel found her hours later, huddled in the corner of her bedroom. Her knees were drawn to her chest, and her arms were wrapped tightly around them. The broken pieces of the mirror were scattered across the hallway, glinting dully in the weak light. Ellie, he said, his voice heavy with concern. What happened? She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the wall. Daniel knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. "I heard the glass," he continued. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though the cuts on her hand told a different story. "It wasn't me," she whispered, her voice so soft he barely heard it. "What wasn't you?" She turned to look at him then, her eyes wide and glistening with tears. "The mirror. It broke on its own. It's not me. It's this place. It's the house." Daniel sighed, his expression a mixture of frustration and worry. "Ellie, this house is old. Things creak. Things fall apart. It's not out to get us." But even as he said the words, a shiver ran down his spine. There was something about the house, something he couldn't explain but couldn't deny. That night, Eleanor sat in her bed, the leather-bound book clutched tightly to her chest. She could still feel the pull of the mirror, even though it was gone. The whispers had returned, soft and insistent, weaving through her thoughts like a dark thread. She opened the book to a random page and found another illustration. A girl standing before a broken mirror, her reflection rising from the shards like a shadow come to life. Beneath it were more of the strange symbols, their meaning just out of reach. The whispers grew louder as she traced the lines of the drawing, and for the first time, she whispered back. The house seemed to respond, its walls creaking and groaning as if alive. Eleanor felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, a numbness that dulled the edges of her fear. She closed the book and lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling. The rain had stopped, but the house was far from silent. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, something shifted, something moved, and Eleanor knew that whatever it was waiting for her. Chapter 5: Voices in the Attic. The next morning, a dense fog clung to the ground like a shroud, casting the world outside in shades of gray. The house felt colder than usual, as if the walls themselves were leaching warmth from the air. Eleanor woke with a start, her heart racing, the echoes of a dream she couldn't remember still swirling in her mind. The whispers had been louder than ever in her sleep, filling her dreams with images she couldn't explain. A dark tunnel stretching endlessly beneath the house, a door carved with intricate symbols, and the sound of something breathing, deep and slow, like the rise and fall of ocean waves. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and glanced around the room. The leather-bound book lay open on her desk, though she was certain she had closed it the night before. The pages seemed to ripple slightly, as if stirred by an unseen breeze. Eleanor shivered and pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. She didn't want to touch the book again, but her eyes were drawn to it, compelled by a force she couldn't resist. The page it had fallen open to was unlike the others. The symbols were more elaborate, their lines sharper and more jagged, and the illustration showed a trapdoor partially hidden by shadows. Beneath the drawing, a single word was written in the strange script. Though she couldn't read the language, she understood its meaning instinctively. Below, the day passed in a haze, the hours slipping by as Eleanor wandered aimlessly through the house. Her father had gone into town to gather supplies, leaving her alone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock in the living room. Eleanor found herself in the kitchen, standing by the large rug that covered the center of the floor. She didn't remember deciding to go there. It was as if her body had moved of its own accord. The rug was faded and fraying at the edges, its once vibrant patterns now dulled by time and neglect. But as she stared at it, she noticed something odd. The edges didn't lie flat against the floor. They seemed to rise ever so slightly, as though something beneath was pushing upward. She knelt down and grasped one corner of the rug, her hands trembling. With a deep breath, she pulled it back, revealing the aged wooden planks of the floor beneath. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the same worn boards she had seen 100 times before. But then she saw it, a small, square outline etched into the wood, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. The lines were faint but precise, forming the shape of a trapdoor. Her heart pounded as she traced the edges with her fingers. The wood felt colder here, as if whatever lay beneath the floor was leaching the warmth from above. She pressed down, and the trapdoor shifted slightly under her weight. A rusted iron ring was embedded in the center, nearly flush with the wood. She grasped it and pulled, straining against the resistance. The door groaned loudly as it lifted, the sound echoing through the empty house. Beneath the trapdoor was a dark, gaping hole. A narrow staircase descended into the earth, its steps carved from stone and slick with moisture. The air that wafted up was damp and stale, carrying the faint, acrid scent of decay. Eleanor hesitated at the top of the stairs, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door and walk away, but the whispers were back, stronger than ever. They urged her forward, promising answers, promising understanding. She took the first step, her bare foot sliding slightly on the wet stone. The second step was easier, and by the third, she was descending steadily, her hand trailing along the cold, rough wall for balance. The staircase spiraled downward, the darkness growing thicker with each step. The faint glow from the kitchen above quickly faded, leaving Eleanor to navigate by touch and the faint pull of the whispers. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the bottom. The air here was heavier, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She found herself in a small, circular room, its walls lined with crumbling bricks slick with moss. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it rested a small, ornate box. The box was made of dark wood, its surface carved with the same symbols that filled the pages of the book. Eleanor approached slowly, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch it. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the whispers stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, as if the world had been plunged into a vacuum. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the box, but the compulsion was too strong to resist. She opened it. Inside was a single object, a shard of mirror, its edges jagged and uneven. The surface was tarnished, but when Eleanor looked into it, she didn't see her own reflection. Instead, she saw the room as it must have been long ago. The walls were intact, the bricks clean and dry. The pedestal was surrounded by candles, their flames flickering and casting dancing shadows across the room. And standing beside the pedestal was a figure. It was a woman, her face hidden beneath a dark hood. She held the shard of mirror in her hands, whispering words Eleanor couldn't hear. The woman's movements were slow and deliberate, her posture rigid with concentration. Eleanor leaned closer, trying to make out the woman's face. As she did, the figure looked up and their eyes met. The woman's face was impossibly familiar. It was her mother. The vision vanished, leaving Eleanor staring into the shard's cracked surface. Her reflection stared back now, but it was wrong. Her eyes glowed faintly, the same sickly yellow she had seen in the dream. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and this time they were not soft or coaxing. They were demanding, insistent, their words merging into a single command. "Bring it back." Eleanor clutched the shard to her chest, the edges digging into her skin. She turned and fled up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. When she reached the kitchen, she slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the rug over it, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know what she had taken or what it meant, but she knew one thing for certain. The house wanted it back. Chapter 6. The door that shouldn't be opened. The shard of mirror burned cold against Eleanor's chest, its jagged edges wrapped in an old piece of cloth she'd torn from her bedsheet. She had hidden it beneath her pillow for now, but the weight of its presence pressed down on her, a constant reminder that the house knew what she had done. She sat at her desk, staring at the open book. The pages had changed again. Now, a new illustration dominated the spread. A girl standing in a long hallway, her shadow stretching unnaturally behind her. The shadow was alive, its tendrils curling and reaching toward her like hungry fingers. Eleanor closed the book with a snap and pushed it away. But no matter where she looked, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching her. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. Her father was still away, delayed by the worsening weather. The isolation should have felt comforting. After all, she had grown used to being alone. But tonight, it was different. The house seemed to pulse with a restless energy, its creaks and groans more pronounced than ever. As the hours dragged on, Eleanor's unease deepened. She wandered from room to room, trying to shake the oppressive feeling that clung to her. She avoided mirrors, instinctively glancing away whenever she passed one. Even her reflection in the darkened windows felt wrong, as though it might move when she wasn't looking. The whispers began again as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the house into shadow. They were louder now, a chorus of voices that echoed through the walls and floorboards. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Anger, desperation, and a cruel edge that made her skin crawl. She found herself back in the living room, drawn by an urge she couldn't ignore. The rug beneath the trapdoor was still in place, but the edges seemed to writhe in the dim light, as though something beneath it was trying to escape. Eleanor backed away, her heart pounding. She told herself she wouldn't go back down there, that she couldn't, but her resolve was slipping. The shard of mirror under her pillow seemed to hum with energy, its presence tugging at her like a leash. The night deepened, and the house grew colder. Eleanor curled up in her bed, clutching the shard in its makeshift wrapping. Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, the whispers grew louder, merging into a singular voice that dripped with malice. "You can't keep it." The voice was low and guttural, like the growl of a wild animal. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, her breath hitching in her throat. The room was dark, but the shadows seemed to shift and twist, forming shapes that dissolved as soon as she tried to focus on them. The voice came again, this time closer. "It's not yours to take." Eleanor bolted upright, clutching the shard tightly. "Leave me alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. The room grew still, the silence oppressive. Then, from the far corner, a faint movement caught her eye. A shadow detached itself from the others, slithering along the floor like smoke. It crawled toward her bed, its form constantly shifting. One moment a mass of writhing tendrils, the next a vaguely human silhouette. Eleanor froze, her mind racing. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. The shadow reached the edge of her bed and began to rise, its shape becoming more distinct. It was a figure now, tall and lean, its face obscured by darkness. "Give it back," it said, its voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Eleanor clutched the shard tighter, her hands trembling. "No," she managed to say, her voice barely audible. The shadow didn't move closer, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the room with an oppressive weight. The air grew colder, and Eleanor's breath came out in visible puffs. "You don't understand what you've done," the shadow hissed. "It belongs to us. To me." Eleanor shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It was in the house," she whispered. "I found it. It's mine now." The shadow let out a low, rumbling laugh, a sound that made her blood run cold. "Foolish child. You think you can take from this place without consequence? You think you can keep it?" It lunged toward her, and Eleanor screamed. throwing herself off the bed. She hit the floor hard. The shard clutched protectively against her chest. The shadow recoiled, its form writhing and twisting as though in pain. The shard. It was the shard. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, holding the wrapped shard out in front of her like a weapon. The shadow hissed and shrank back, its edges fraying as though it were unraveling. "You can't escape," it snarled. "The house won't let you." With that, it dissolved into the floor, disappearing into the darkness. The whispers faded, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt deafening. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat in the corner of her room, the shard still clutched in her hands. The house was quiet now, but she knew it wasn't over. Whatever she had taken, it was important. To the house, to the thing in the shadows, and to something deeper, something she couldn't yet understand. As dawn broke, casting pale light through the windows, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't stay in the house. She had to find a way to escape, to leave it behind and take the shard with her. But as she stood and looked out the window, her heart sank. The fog was still there, thicker than ever, curling around the house like a living thing. And in the distance, barely visible through the haze, figures were moving. They were coming. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Mirror. The morning light was weak, diluted by the oppressive fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Eleanor stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to focus on the figures moving in the distance. They were indistinct, their shapes blurred by the mist, but they were coming closer. Slowly, steadily. Her mind raced. She couldn't stay here. The house was alive. The shadows were hunting her, and now, whatever was outside was closing in. But where could she go? The road leading to the house was swallowed by the fog, and beyond that, the woods stretched endlessly, dark and uninviting. She turned away from the window, her heart pounding. The shard of mirror sat on her desk now, still wrapped in the torn strip of bedsheet. It seemed to pulse faintly, as if responding to her fear. Eleanor approached it cautiously, her hand hovering over the makeshift bundle. She had no idea what the shard truly was or why it was so important to the house, but she couldn't bring herself to leave it behind. Something about it felt connected to her, as if it was a part of her story she hadn't yet uncovered. The whispers returned, faint and fragmented. They came from the walls, the floor, the very air around her. Words half-formed, syllables that twisted in her ears and sent shivers down her spine. The fog brings them back. The shard, the key, the curse. Run, girl, before it's too late. The last voice was louder than the rest, sharp and clear. Eleanor spun around, but the room was empty. She grabbed the shard and wrapped it tightly in the cloth, tucking it into her jacket pocket. The fog had crept closer to the house, its tendrils curling against the windows like fingers. Eleanor ventured downstairs, each step careful and deliberate. The air grew colder as she descended, the temperature dropping so sharply that her breath turned to mist. The living room was unrecognizable. The furniture seemed to sag, the walls appeared warped, and the shadows were darker, deeper, as if they had weight and substance. The rug covering the trapdoor had shifted slightly, revealing a corner of the wooden hatch beneath. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence, loud and insistent. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. Another knock, followed by a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. She backed away, her eyes darting to the windows. The fog outside was alive with movement now, shadows flitting back and forth. Shapes pressed against the glass, distorted and unnatural. The knocking turned to pounding, the force shaking the door in its frame. Eleanor stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers swirled around her, a cacophony of voices that drowned out her thoughts. "They've come for it. Don't let them in. You can't stop them. She turned and fled toward the kitchen, her feet sliding on the cold wooden floor. The pounding followed her, reverberating through the house like a drumbeat. She reached the kitchen and pressed herself against the wall, clutching the shard in her pocket like a talisman. The trapdoor. Her eyes darted to the rug, and the thought struck her like a lightning bolt. Whatever lay beneath the house, whatever had drawn her down there in the first place, it was connected to the shard. It had to be. The pounding at the front door grew more frantic, accompanied now by the sound of glass cracking. Eleanor ran to the rug and threw it aside, revealing the trapdoor. She yanked it open and stared down into the blackness below. The whispers grew louder, forming a single word that echoed in her mind. Descend. She hesitated for only a moment before climbing down the stone steps, pulling the hatch shut behind her. The air in the underground chamber was damp and heavy, carrying the same acrid scent of decay she had noticed before. Her footsteps echoed as she reached the bottom, her eyes adjusting to the faint glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The pedestal was still there, but now it was surrounded by strange markings that hadn't been there before. The symbols glowed faintly, their edges shifting and writhing like living things. Eleanor approached the pedestal cautiously. The whispers were louder here, but they no longer felt disjointed. They were a chant now, a rhythm that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She pulled the shard from her pocket and unwrapped it, holding it up to the light. The tarnished surface caught the faint glow of the symbols, and for a moment, she thought she saw something moving within its reflection. The air shifted, a sudden gust blowing through the chamber and extinguishing the glow of the markings. Eleanor spun around, her heart racing. The darkness was complete now, pressing against her like a physical force. Then she saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were being pulled forward by invisible strings. The figures stopped a few feet away, their heads tilted at unnatural angles as they stared at her with empty, hollow eyes. "You shouldn't have taken it," one of them rasped, its voice a hollow echo. Eleanor clutched the shard tightly, backing away. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "The house," another figure said, its tone filled with malice. "The shard belongs to the house." Eleanor shook her head, her grip on the shard tightening. "It's mine," she said, her voice stronger now. "I found it. It called to me." The figures moved closer, their shapes flickering like shadows cast by an unseen flame. "It will take you, girl," one of them hissed. "The shard is a curse, a chain, and you are bound." Eleanor stumbled backward, her foot catching on the edge of the pedestal. The shard in her hand pulsed violently, its glow intensifying. The figures recoiled slightly, their forms wavering. "You think you can fight it?" one of them snarled. "You think you can escape?" Eleanor raised the shard, its light now blinding. The figures screamed, their voices merging into a single, agonized wail. The chamber shook, the ground beneath her feet cracking and splintering. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was the shard shattering in her hands, its pieces scattering like stars. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was back in her room. The shard was gone, and the whispers had fallen silent. The fog outside the window was clearing, revealing the faint outline of the forest beyond. But as she sat up, she noticed something strange. The markings from the underground chamber were etched faintly into her skin, glowing softly in the dim light. The house was quiet, but Eleanor knew the truth. It wasn't over. Chapter 8, Ashes in the Garden. The room felt different now. Eleanor could feel it the moment she awoke, her senses tingling with an awareness she couldn't explain. The light filtering through the window seemed too bright, the air too thin, as though something had changed in the very fabric of the house. Her fingers grazed the skin on her arms, and a chill ran through her. She could feel the markings now, faint but unmistakable. They were etched into her skin like a brand, hidden beneath the surface, as though they had always been there, waiting for her to wake up and notice. She sat up slowly, her body stiff, as if she hadn't moved in days. Her reflection in the window caught her eye. Her face looked the same, but there was something about it that felt unfamiliar. The skin seemed too pale, the eyes too wide, as if she was no longer entirely herself. The markings. She pressed her fingers against her arms again, feeling for the strange symbols that had burned into her flesh. They weren't just on her arms. They snaked across her shoulders, down her sides, even along the nape of her neck. They had the same eerie glow as the symbols in the underground chamber, and as she focused on them, the faintest whisper, almost imperceptible, touched her mind. Beneath the skin, Eleanor shuddered, the air growing colder as the words echoed in her mind. The voice was familiar now, the one that had spoken to her in the depths of the house, the one that had warned her. But what did it mean? Beneath the skin, the markings were no longer just a reminder of what had happened. They were a part of her. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a constant hum beneath her flesh. She couldn't tell if it was the house calling to her again or something else, something far more sinister. She stood shakily, her legs unsteady, and made her way toward the door. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet, like a predator watching from the shadows. She moved carefully, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet in the hallway. The silence was deafening. She didn't know if it was the house, or if it was her own mind playing tricks, but something felt wrong. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor hesitated, a cold shiver crawling up her spine. The stairs felt different now, as if they had shifted somehow, as though they were no longer just stairs but a path that led somewhere dark, somewhere she didn't want to go. She could feel the house breathing beneath her feet, as though it was alive, its pulse syncing with hers. Beneath the skin, the voice whispered again, clearer now. The hum of the markings was louder, almost deafening. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the pulse beneath her skin. It was rhythmic, steady, but there was something else, something dark beneath that pulse, like the quietest scream just out of reach. Eleanor took a deep breath and forced herself to move, her legs feeling like lead. She reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself standing in the living room. The door was wide open, the fog outside thicker than it had ever been, spilling into the hallway like it was hungry to consume everything. Her heart pounded. She didn't want to go outside, not with the fog, not with what was waiting for her in the woods. The figures from before had vanished, but she knew they were still there, lurking just out of sight. The markings on her skin burned with the same urgency as the shard had, as if they were telling her to go, to leave, to run. But where could she go? She turned back toward the hallway, toward the trapdoor she had uncovered so many nights ago. The whispers had grown louder now, a chorus of voices that reverberated through the walls, swirling around her like smoke. You have to go back. You belong here. You are not free. Eleanor clutched her head, squeezing her eyes shut as the voices clamored in her mind, their words merging into a jumbled mess. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward her, tendrils of darkness reaching out like fingers trying to grab hold of her. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching for the door frame. The walls seemed to press in on her, the house growing tighter, smaller, like it was closing around her. Beneath the skin, the words were clearer now, louder, almost as though they were coming from within her, not just the house. She wasn't sure what was happening anymore. Was it the house? Was it her? Was she the one who was changing? Eleanor's chest tightened, and she reached up, her fingers tracing the markings on her neck, where the symbols were deepest. They burned with a searing heat, and for a moment, she thought she saw something moving beneath her skin. Something dark, something alive. The house wasn't just alive. It was feeding off of her. The realization hit her like a slap. She had given it a part of herself when she took the shard. It had burrowed into her, twisting itself into her flesh, into her very soul. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was part of it now. Beneath the skin, the markings seemed to throb with a malevolent energy, and in that moment, Eleanor knew what she had to do. She had to go back to the underground chamber, to the pedestal, to the thing that had started this whole nightmare. The house had claimed her, and now it was time to claim what it wanted. She turned toward the kitchen, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her. But she kept moving, her mind set on the dark path ahead. She reached the kitchen door and stopped. Her fingers brushed the handle, but as she stepped into the next room, she froze. The fog outside had seeped into the house. It was curling in through the cracks beneath the door, thick and swirling. It moved like a living thing, and as Eleanor watched in horror, the fog seemed to take shape. Figures, more of them, pressed against the windows, their faces pale and indistinct, their eyes wide and hollow. And then, a voice, the same one that had whispered to her before. "Come outside, child. Come and join us." The fog twisted and thickened, as if it were pulling her toward the door, toward the waiting figures outside. Eleanor knew what she had to do. She had to face it. She had to go back, to give the house what it wanted, or it would claim her forever. But as she took a step toward the door, the markings on her skin flared with heat, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. They screamed at her, urging her to run, to leave this place. But the call of the house, the pull of whatever darkness it had released inside her, was too strong. Eleanor gritted her teeth and reached for the door, her fingers brushing the cold, fog-covered surface. She opened it, and the fog rushed in, swallowing her whole. Chapter 9. The Descent. The fog swallowed Eleanor whole, its cold fingers wrapping around her like a suffocating cloak. The air tasted bitter and thick, clinging to her skin, her lungs. She gasped, stumbling forward as the world around her blurred into a swirl of gray and shadows. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, the ground beneath her feet shifting, as though it was no longer solid but part of something far darker, something beneath the surface. She had no choice but to keep moving. The house had pulled her out into the fog, and now the fog was pulling her deeper. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faintest echoes of whispers, voices that seemed both foreign and familiar, all mixed into an incomprehensible hum. They whispered her name, the sound dragging her forward, compelling her to follow. Eleanor. She could hear them so clearly, the voices calling her from just beyond her reach, just beyond the fog. They sounded like her mother, like the girls she had seen in the mirrors, like the strangers who had once walked these halls. But now, they were something else. Their voices had grown hollow, twisted, full of something malevolent. The ground beneath her feet cracked, and for a moment, Eleanor thought the earth itself was about to open up beneath her. But it didn't. Instead, the fog parted briefly, revealing a path of cracked stones leading into a deeper darkness. Eleanor hesitated. The markings on her skin burned hotter now, their glow pulsing in rhythm with the chaotic whispers in her mind. The house, or whatever was left of it, had brought her here. She could feel it in the air, thick and heavy with dread. The very earth seemed to hum with an ancient, terrible power. And deep down, Eleanor knew. This was it. This was the final step. With a shiver, she took a step onto the path, the stones cold and sharp underfoot. Her legs felt weak, as though the very earth was trying to pull her down, but she kept moving. Each step brought her closer to the darkness, closer to the place she knew she had to go. She had no choice now. The house was part of her, and she was part of it. There was no escape from that truth. The fog closed in behind her, isolating her in a world of pale gray, as if the air itself had thickened into something solid, something alive. The path stretched endlessly before her, winding into the blackness of the unknown. She could barely see ahead, only the faintest flickers of shapes and movement, as though shadows themselves were following her. She didn't dare turn around. The moment she did, she was sure she would see the figures, the ones that had haunted the edges of her vision since she first arrived at the house. They were always watching, always waiting. As she moved deeper, the air grew colder. The further she walked, the more the fog seemed to press in, clinging to her skin, curling around her hair like a suffocating fog. She tried to ignore it, to push forward, but the chill was unbearable, gnawing at her very bones. And still, the voices pushed her onward, echoing in her mind, in her very soul. "You belong here." The words whispered softly at first, like a breeze that ruffled the leaves of a dying tree. But the more they repeated, the more insistent they became. The fog seemed to thicken around her, and the further she walked, the more the voices twisted into something darker still. Eleanor stumbled. She could feel it now, the pull of something beneath her, something ancient and hungry. Her feet faltered, and she fell to the ground, her hand brushing the cold, sharp stones beneath her. As she pushed herself up, the fog parted momentarily, revealing what she had feared to see. The underground entrance to the house, the one she had discovered only days ago, now opening before her like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She stood frozen, staring down at the doorway. The symbols from the chamber below were etched into the frame, glowing in the faintest light that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The air here felt different, heavier, thicker. The closer she came to the entrance, the more the symbols on her skin burned, searing into her flesh. She could feel the heat radiating from them, but she didn't have the strength to pull away. "Come in." The voice was a low, resonant hum, a command, a plea, a warning. She didn't know who or what was speaking, but it wasn't a voice she could ignore. The call was irresistible. Eleanor took a deep breath, her mind fogged with fear, with the weight of a decision she had already made. She didn't turn away. She couldn't. This was her destiny now, her fate tied to the house and to whatever it was that had claimed her. The door beckoned her. With shaking hands, she grasped the cold iron handle and pushed. It opened with a groan, the sound of wood scraping against stone filling the silence around her. The darkness beyond the door was absolute, the shadows thick and oppressive. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated again. But then, she stepped forward, into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind her, and she was plunged into utter blackness. The air in the room was damp and heavy, the temperature dropping with each breath she took. She couldn't see, but she could feel something watching her, waiting. The whispers returned, their sound growing louder and more dissonant, until it felt as though they were coming from all around her, from beneath the very walls, the floor, the ceiling. "You should have never come back." The words were sharp, like the snap of breaking glass. Eleanor flinched, but she couldn't stop now. She had come too far, and there was no turning back. The house had drawn her here for a reason, and she had to know why. She moved through the dark, her hands outstretched in front of her, feeling the cool stone walls, the rough edges of the surface beneath her fingertips. The deeper she moved, the more the air seemed to thrum with power, a strange electricity that hummed beneath her skin. The symbols on her flesh pulsed in time with the rhythm, growing stronger, hotter. And then, in the center of the room, a light flickered into existence. It wasn't a flame, not a candle, but something more, something ancient and strange. The light was a deep, unnatural blue, casting long shadows that danced and twisted across the walls. Eleanor's heart raced as she stepped closer, the air around her growing thick with an energy she couldn't comprehend. She could feel the pull of the light, like a gravitational force dragging her toward it. When she reached the center of the room, she stopped. In front of her was a pedestal, like the one she had seen in the underground chamber. But this one was different. The air around it shimmered, as though the space itself was alive, breathing. The surface of the pedestal was carved with the same symbols that were on her skin, glowing faintly. And on the pedestal was something else. A shard. The same shard she had once held. The one that had started all of this. But now, it was different. It was larger, brighter, its edges sharp and jagged. The light emanating from it bathed the room in an eerie glow. Eleanor stepped forward, her body moving almost of its own accord. Her hand stretched toward the shard, the pull of it stronger than anything she had felt before. She could feel the darkness beneath the surface of the light, something ancient and hungry, waiting for her touch. Her fingers brushed the shard's surface, and in that moment, everything went dark. The world around her collapsed into nothingness. The light went out. The whispers silenced. Everything went black. Chapter 10. A Father's Failing Eyes. When Eleanor opened her eyes, it wasn't to the familiar darkness of the underground chamber. Instead, she found herself standing in a place that was neither familiar nor real. The ground beneath her feet felt like a soft, shifting mass, the texture of it changing with each step she took. It was as though she was walking on something not solid, but something alive, breathing, pulsing, shifting beneath her weight. Her feet sank slightly with every step, but she couldn't stop moving. The air was thick and damp, but it was the weight of silence that struck her the hardest. No whispers, no voices, just the oppressive quiet of an empty, forgotten world. A world that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, with no horizon, no point of reference. Just the soft, shifting ground beneath her and the faintest, mist-like fog swirling around her feet. Eleanor stood still for a moment, her senses stretching out into the void, trying to make sense of her surroundings. But there was nothing to grasp. The silence was too vast, too consuming. There was nothing but a quiet emptiness that seemed to pulse with its own dark rhythm. She tried to breathe, but the air felt different now. Heavy, thick, like it wasn't meant for her lungs. She could feel something pressing down on her chest, a weight of inevitability that made each breath a struggle. But still, she walked. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here, or why. She only knew that she was no longer in control, not entirely. Something else was guiding her now, pushing her forward, urging her toward the darkness. Then, far in the distance, Eleanor saw a faint light, an impossibly bright point of illumination cutting through the endless void. It wasn't the same eerie blue glow she had seen in the underground chamber, but something warmer, softer, the kind of light that promised answers. She moved toward it, her feet sinking deeper into the shifting ground. Each step felt longer than the last, like she was wading through something thick and gelatinous, something that refused to let her go. The further she went, the stronger the pull of the light became. It was as though it knew her, knew what she needed, what she had become. The light flickered like a distant star, growing larger as she approached. The air around her grew warmer, and with each step, her skin seemed to prickle with a strange energy. It was like static electricity, buzzing along her spine. She could feel it drawing her in, pulling her towards something she couldn't name, something she had already been branded to. She didn't know how she knew, but she could feel it. This was the place. This was where it had all been leading. As she neared the light, she saw it more clearly, a vast, floating shape, obscured in the shifting fog. It was not a person. Not even a figure, but something larger, something alien and powerful. It was as though it was part of the void itself, a thing that existed in the space between spaces. The closer she got, the more she understood. The thing wasn't just a shape. It was a presence. It was watching her, waiting for her. She could feel its gaze, heavy and all-encompassing, like a weight pressing down on her soul. "Come closer," the voice came, low and unearthly, like a distant murmur of wind. But the voice wasn't audible. It was inside her, deep within her bones, vibrating through her. The words weren't spoken. They were felt. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar now. She had heard it before. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the house, the one that had pulled her into the depths of the darkness. It was the voice of the house, of the thing that had taken root inside her. It had been waiting for her to return. But this wasn't the house. This was something else, something far older, far more powerful. It wasn't just pulling her back. It was pulling her into something greater. Eleanor stepped forward, and the air around her shimmered. The ground shifted again, the fog swirling more violently at her feet. She was no longer walking through a world of darkness. Now, it felt as though she was moving through a veil, a hollow space that separated one reality from another. It was like walking on the edge of something, a precipice between worlds. As she took another step, the light suddenly exploded in front of her, a blinding, searing flash that enveloped everything. She squeezed her eyes shut, but it did nothing to block the light. She could still feel its heat, its energy, coursing through her veins, pulling her in, claiming her. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light faded. The ground beneath her feet became solid again, and the air returned to its oppressive stillness. She opened her eyes to find herself standing in a room, but it wasn't the underground chamber, and it wasn't the house. It was a vast, empty space, floating in the void, held together by nothing more than the faintest shimmer of light. The walls were invisible. There was nothing but an endless stretch of blackness, like the depths of the universe itself. Yet, the space felt familiar. It felt like the house, but in a twisted, distorted way. The markings on her skin burned brighter than before, their glow suffusing the space around her, casting long shadows on the invisible walls. It was as though she had crossed into a place that existed outside time, outside reason, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. And there, standing before her, was the thing, the presence that had been waiting for her. It was not a figure. It was not human. It was something far older, something not bound by flesh. The being stood in the center of the room, its form shifting, ever-changing. One moment, it was a mass of swirling darkness. The next, it was an endless stretch of eyes, thousands upon thousands, blinking and watching her with a hunger she could not escape. There was no face, no body, no shape to it. It was everything and nothing, all at once. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. It rumbled through her, deep within her chest. "You have come." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. The house, the thing that had taken hold of her. It was here, in this place. She was in the very heart of it now, and it was more powerful than anything she could have imagined. It was no longer just the house. It was the essence of the house itself, of whatever ancient force had given it life. She didn't know what it wanted from her. She didn't know what it needed, but she felt the pull of it, the hunger that radiated from it, drawing her in, consuming her. And then, for the first time, Eleanor understood. She wasn't just part of the house anymore. She was part of this. The thing was not the house. The thing was the darkness that lived beneath it, the force that had fed on her grief, on her fears. It had waited for her to come, to make her a part of it, to merge with her. And now it was time. The markings on her skin flared brighter, and the thing, The presence stirred, its shifting mass stretching toward her, pulling her in. It was no longer just a thing waiting to consume her. It was already a part of her, and she was already part of it. Eleanor reached out, her hand trembling, her heart beating in time with the pulsing darkness. As her fingers touched the shifting mass before her, the world around her seemed to crumble away. The veil was slipping, unraveling, and she was falling into the heart of the thing. There was no escape now. There was only darkness, only hunger. And then the silence returned. Chapter 11. The Night She Smiled. Eleanor awoke to an eerie stillness, the kind that suffocated, that filled every inch of space and left her breathless. For a moment, she wasn't sure where she was, or if she was anywhere at all. The darkness pressed against her, thick and heavy, like the weight of the earth itself had fallen on her chest. Her limbs were frozen, her senses dulled, and she struggled to pull herself out of the fog that clung to her mind. Her first breath was shallow, the air cold and stale, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't the damp, oppressive air she had grown accustomed to in the underground rooms of the house. No, this was different. It was sharp, biting, like it came from somewhere outside of time, outside of this place. Eleanor's eyes snapped open, but nothing had changed. She was still surrounded by the same suffocating darkness, the same void that seemed to stretch forever. The light, that searing, blinding flash she had seen before. Was it a dream? Or had it been a part of something greater, something she couldn't understand? And then a sound, a faint, unsettling sound, like the rustle of paper or fabric, echoed through the darkness. It wasn't a whisper this time. No, it was more distinct, more tangible. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't the familiar voice that had haunted her before, the one that spoke in riddles and commands. This was something else, something older. Her body stiffened, and slowly, against her own will, her eyes began to adjust, the faintest sliver of light starting to cut through the oppressive blackness. It was a dim glow, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make out the edges of what surrounded her. The first thing she noticed was the ground beneath her, soft, thick, and moving. It was as though she was standing on something alive, something breathing, something that shouldn't be. The surface beneath her feet shifted and pulsed like a heart, the floor of this place, whatever it was, alive in its own right. It was the same sensation she had felt earlier, that feeling of walking on a surface that was more than solid, more than real. Her stomach churned as the ground seemed to shift again, and Eleanor instinctively took a step back, though there was nowhere to go. There were no walls, no boundaries here, just an endless expanse of something that stretched beyond reason. The ground itself seemed to move with her, as though it were part of her, following her every step. The faint light grew stronger, but it didn't come from any specific source. Instead, it seemed to radiate from the very fabric of the air itself, a sickly glow that twisted and flickered like dying embers. Eleanor reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the air. It felt like static, like electricity, but it was colder, darker, more malignant. She could feel it coursing through her skin, making her muscles twitch and her bones ache. And then she saw it, a figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing at the edge of her vision. It was only a shape at first, an outline of something distant and intangible. But as her eyes focused, it took form. Something taller, something more than human. Its body was indistinct, shifting like smoke, constantly changing. And yet, there was something about it that was so familiar, so deeply ingrained within her own being, that she could not look away. It had no face, no features, no identity. It was not human, but it was something more. The presence that had been waiting for her, the one that had been pulling her into this place. She knew it now. She knew what it was and what it wanted. It wanted her. The realization struck her like a hammer, and she staggered back, her heart racing, her skin tingling with the force of something more terrible than fear. The thing, whatever it was, did not speak, but its presence was enough to send a tremor through her very soul. She could feel it, could feel the pull, the invisible tether that connected her to this place, to this being. And the more she tried to resist, the more the weight of it pressed in on her, the more the feeling of inevitability grew. It had always been there, hadn't it? From the moment she first set foot in the house, from the moment the strange whispers started to coil around her, the presence had been there, waiting. It had shaped her, consumed her, and now it had brought her to this point, to this void. The figure did not move. It simply hovered there, its form shifting, twisting in and out of existence, never quite settling, always uncertain. But the energy it exuded was suffocating. Eleanor could feel it pressing down on her chest, on her heart, on her very breath. It wanted something from her. It needed her. And she didn't know what it was, but she felt it deep within her. Her vision blurred as the light from the thing flickered again, and she felt her body begin to tremble. The air crackled around her, thickening, warping. It was as though reality itself was starting to warp, to twist in ways that couldn't be explained. The walls of this place, if it even had walls, seemed to pulse, to beat like the heart of a living creature, the pulse matching the frantic beat of her own heart. The darkness was coming. The thought flashed through her mind like a sudden burst of clarity, but before she could process it, the world around her seemed to collapse. The air around her grew impossibly thick, the light dimming to a faint, flickering whisper, like the last breath of a dying star. The ground beneath her feet twisted and buckled, shifting like liquid as the pulse grew faster, more insistent. Something was breaking. Eleanor staggered, her feet slipping on the shifting ground. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she fell to her knees, her hands outstretched to steady herself. Her palms met the ground, and as soon as they did, a terrible jolt of energy shot through her, a searing heat that made her bones feel as though they were on fire. She gasped, the pain too much to bear, and yet she couldn't move. The thing, whatever it was, had a hold on her, deep within her, and no matter how hard she tried to pull away, it was too late. She was already becoming part of it. The whispers started again, but they were no longer distant, no longer foreign. They were inside her now, filling her mind, seeping into her thoughts like a poison. You have come to claim your place. The words rang in her mind, louder than the pain, louder than the darkness. They filled her, consumed her. She could feel herself unraveling, coming apart at the seams. The markings on her skin burned with an unbearable intensity, the symbols twisting, warping, like they were alive, like they were feeding on her. And then, in the distance, she heard something else. A sound that wasn't a whisper, but a scream that echoed through the very fabric of the void, a scream that sounded far too much like her own. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she tried to rise, but the darkness clung to her, dragging her back down. The ground beneath her trembled, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't just falling into the void. She was falling through it, into something far worse. You will never escape. The words pierced her like a blade, and just as the darkness closed in around her, she finally understood. This place wasn't just a void. It was a prison. Her prison. Chapter 12. Blood Beneath the Wallpaper. Eleanor's world was a blur of shadow and flame, a suffocating blend of darkness and light that flickered like the dying embers of a long-forgotten fire. She no longer knew where her body ended and the air began. The pain of her existence stretching out beyond reason, beyond understanding. Her mind was a fractured thing now, split between the haunting weight of the present and the echoes of something darker, something ancient, clawing at the edges of her consciousness. The ground beneath her trembled again, and she felt herself being pulled, not by her own will, but by something stronger. She couldn't fight it anymore. The sensation of being dragged through this place, the void, the prison, was too overwhelming. Her limbs felt heavy, like they were encased in stone, and every step she tried to take only made her sink deeper into the ever-shifting, living surface beneath her feet. But the darkness was not just external. It was inside her now. It was spreading like a disease, worming its way into the very core of her being. The markings on her skin burned brighter, hotter, with each passing second, as if they were alive, feeding off the darkness that had claimed her. Her fingers trembled, and when she tried to lift them to her face, the pain became unbearable, a raw, searing ache that made her wish she could pull herself apart just to escape it. The voice came again, low and omnipresent, vibrating through her bones, more insistent this time. It was not a whisper, nor a murmur. It was a command. "You are bound. You are one with the darkness." Eleanor gasped, but no sound came from her throat. It didn't matter. She had already surrendered to the force that controlled her now. She could feel it deep within her, in every cell, in every breath. The house, the entity, whatever it was, it had seeped into her, made its home in the very marrow of her bones. She was its vessel now, its conduit. There was no escape. The ground beneath her twisted, pulling at her, like the fingers of some unseen hand reaching from the depths of the earth. The shadows that had once seemed so foreign to her were now a part of her, twisting and turning around her like a cloak, like an extension of her own flesh. The air hummed with a deep, resonant power, a terrible force that shook her very soul. And then, the presence, the thing, manifested again. But this time, it was no longer a distant figure. It was right before her, in the space she occupied. It didn't have form, not exactly, but she could feel it. Its presence, its weight. It loomed over her, not in a physical sense, but in the way a storm looms over the horizon, powerful and inevitable. It was in everything, surrounding her, engulfing her. "You are the key." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a declaration. The words reverberated inside her mind, thrumming through the very fibers of her being. She could feel them, a truth, an inevitability. She was the key. But what it unlocked, what it was meant to unlock, she could not yet comprehend. The answer was locked away, buried beneath layers of the darkness that consumed her, waiting to reveal itself at the moment when she could no longer refuse. A sudden force gripped her chest, and she gasped, unable to breathe. It was as though the air itself had thickened, become too heavy for her lungs to hold. Her body fought against it, but it was futile. The presence pressed in, filling her from the inside out. It was as though it had entered her heart, lodged itself there, and now it was pulling her apart, piece by piece. Her thoughts were no longer her own. They were fragments, flashes of images that didn't belong to her, memories she had never experienced. A vision of the house, the walls cracked and decaying, the windows shattered, the doors broken. But it was more than that. It was as if she was seeing the house for what it had always been, a prison. And then she saw her mother's face, the face that had been buried deep inside her, the one she had tried so desperately to forget. Her mother, pale and cold, her eyes empty and hollow. Eleanor tried to scream, but the voice that rose in her throat was not hers. It was a low, guttural sound, a twisted echo of the thing that had taken hold of her. The presence, the house, had stolen her voice, her humanity. It was using her now, pulling at her, twisting her. "You are the vessel. You are the way." The words burned into her mind. She wanted to fight them, to push them away, but there was nothing left inside her to fight with. She was nothing but a conduit now, a living, breathing prison for the force that had consumed her. She was bound, tethered to this place, to this presence, forever. But even in the depths of her despair, something stirred within her. A flicker of resistance, a sliver of defiance, hidden deep within her core. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She could feel it. Eleanor's hands trembled as they reached toward the air, toward the darkness that surrounded her. Her fingers brushed against the surface of it, and she felt something cold and ancient, something that had been waiting, dormant, for a very long time. The room around her began to shift again, the darkness pulling back, retreating into the corners of the space like an animal withdrawing into the shadows. For a moment, the weight lifted from her chest, and Eleanor felt a strange, fleeting sense of freedom. It was as if she had been given a glimpse of something outside the prison, something that wasn't bound by the suffocating force of the darkness. But the relief was short-lived. The presence that had been watching her, waiting for her, surged forward once again, filling the space, reclaiming her. It didn't let her go. It was too strong, too consuming. "The house calls you." The words cut through her like a blade, and Eleanor realized, with horrifying clarity, that the house was not just a place. It was not just an entity. It was alive, aware, and it had been waiting for her, waiting for this moment, the moment when she would be bound to it, when she would become part of it. It had always been about her. The thing, the house, the presence, the force that had taken her, was not simply feeding on her fears, her grief. It was feeding on her very essence, so that it could be reborn. It had chosen her. It had drawn her in, marked her, twisted her into something that was no longer human. The walls around her began to pulse again, the vibrations deep and resonant. The darkness was shifting, moving with purpose. It wasn't just around her anymore. It was inside her. The prison had become her, and she was it. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists, the markings on her skin burning hotter than ever. She could feel her own power, the darkness rising within her, pushing out the last remnants of the girl she had once been. She was no longer just a victim. She was the embodiment of the prison, the key to its release. She was no longer Eleanor. She was the house, and it was calling her. Chapter 13. The Basement's Hunger. Eleanor stood at the precipice of herself, a fractured version of the girl who had once stumbled into this house, confused and broken. The sense of something vast, something unknowable, was inside her now. The darkness had taken root in her very soul, curling through her veins like a poison that had no antidote. She was no longer Eleanor. She was something else, something more ancient, more terrible. The house had awakened inside her, and now it was in control. Her thoughts were like shards of glass, each one reflecting a different piece of the nightmare she had become. Her body, once her own, was now a conduit, a vessel through which the power of the house could flow. The markings on her skin had ceased to burn, but they were still there, alive in a way that made her feel like her own skin was a stranger to her. The air around her was thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere had become something darker, something hostile. The walls, the floor, the very ground beneath her feet pulsed with a rhythm that she couldn't escape. It was as if the house itself was breathing, its heartbeat synced with her own, and with every beat, the darkness grew stronger. She had tried to fight it, tried to resist, but now she knew there was no escaping. She had come to this place seeking refuge, but there was no refuge here. There was only the pull, the inevitable drawing of her into something she couldn't understand. And yet, she didn't need to understand it. She could feel it. She could feel it in every cell of her body. She had become one with it. The house had taken her, twisted her, and now it was hers to control. She moved, but the motion wasn't her own. It wasn't like walking anymore. It was more like floating, her feet not quite touching the ground, her body moving with the rhythm of the house. She could hear its whispers, its calls, deep within her, louder now, guiding her through the corridors of her own mind, through the labyrinth of the house. The walls seemed to close in around her, and yet they opened, leading her forward, deeper into the unknown. Eleanor didn't need to think to know where she was going. The house called her, and she obeyed. Her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her through the dark, oppressive halls. The once familiar rooms were now unfamiliar, their very shapes altered by the power that had been unleashed within them. The house was no longer a home. It was a thing of darkness, a creature that fed on her fear, on her sorrow. She reached the door that had once seemed so innocuous, so mundane. But now it was more than that. It was a threshold, a barrier between this world and the one beyond. Beyond that door lay the truth that she had been running from, the truth that had always been waiting for her. It was the key to everything, the final piece of the puzzle. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for the door. The air crackled with energy, the pulse of the house growing louder, faster, as if it were alive and aware of her movements. The door groaned in response, its hinges protesting against her touch. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not now. Not when she was so close. With a single, forceful push, the door swung open. The room beyond was a nightmare made real. The walls were covered in symbols, ancient and twisted, pulsing with the same dark energy that flowed through Eleanor's veins. The floor was cracked, as though it had been torn apart by some unseen force. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface covered in dust, its edges worn by time. And upon the pedestal was a book. It lay open, its pages yellowed with age, its contents written in a language she couldn't understand. But that didn't matter. She knew what it was. She could feel its power, its pull, deep within her. The book was the heart of the house. It was the source of its power, its life. And now it was hers to command. She stepped forward, her hands trembling as they reached out to touch the book. The moment her fingers brushed the pages, a surge of energy erupted from it, coursing through her body like a lightning strike. The power of the house flooded her, overwhelming her senses, filling her with a dark ecstasy that she could no longer control. The walls of the room shuddered as if the house itself were reacting to the energy she had unleashed. The darkness thickened, pressing in around her, suffocating her, but she didn't care. She was beyond fear now. The house was hers, and she was the house. Together, they were unstoppable. She turned the pages, each one revealing more of the twisted, incomprehensible symbols that seemed to call to her. She didn't need to read the words. She could feel them, like a melody she had known her whole life, a song that resonated deep within her soul. She could feel the power building inside her, growing stronger with each turn of the page. And then, she found it. A name that wasn't hers, but that she knew deep in the core of her being. It was the name of the house. It was the name of the darkness. The name was ancient, powerful, and when she spoke it, the entire house trembled. The awakening. The room shook violently, the very foundation of the house cracking beneath her. The walls began to melt, dissolving into the darkness, and the ground beneath her feet became unstable, shifting like a living thing. Eleanor felt herself lifted off the ground, her body floating as though weightless, as the darkness swirled around her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. She could hear the house now, its voice a cacophony of whispers and roars, a symphony of destruction. It was calling to her, calling her to complete the final step, to finish what had been started so long ago. But even as the house called her, she knew that it was not enough. The darkness was not satisfied. It wanted more. It wanted her to become something greater, something beyond human. It wanted her to be the conduit through which it would unleash its true form upon the world. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She didn't need to. The power was already inside her, pulsing through her like blood in her veins. She raised her hands, and the shadows responded, swirling around her in a vortex of pure energy. The house responded, its walls cracking and crumbling as it gave itself fully to her control. She had become the house, and with that realization came the final piece of the puzzle, the thing she had been avoiding for so long, the truth that had always been buried beneath the surface of her mind. The house was not just a place. It was a force, a living, breathing entity that had been waiting for her to awaken it, for her to free it from the confines of its walls. The house was a prison, yes, but it was also a gateway, a portal to something greater, something far more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. And she was the key. With a single, triumphant roar, Eleanor unleashed the power that had been building inside her, and the house shattered. The darkness was free, and it was coming for the world. Chapter 14. Dreams that were not her own. Eleanor's body floated above the ruins of the house, her form suspended in the void, where time no longer mattered. Her mind, too, seemed to be lost in the endless dark that surrounded her, the silence pressing against her ears like the weight of 1,000 forgotten screams. There was no sound, no light, only the vast, suffocating emptiness that had swallowed the house whole. The world as she had known it was gone. The destruction had come swiftly, tearing apart the foundation of the house, dismantling it from the inside out. The walls had buckled and crumbled like paper, the windows shattered, and the roof had collapsed inward, as if the very bones of the house had been broken by some monstrous force. It had all been consumed, sucked into the darkness, swallowed by the very thing that had once lived within those walls. The house, once a prison, had become a tomb, and she had been the one to set it free. She could feel the power that surged through her veins, pulsing with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. The darkness, her darkness, was no longer just an extension of her. It was her. It was her flesh, her blood, her soul. It had become so deeply intertwined with her that she could no longer tell where she ended and it began. The shadows twisted and writhed around her like living creatures, responding to her every thought, every flicker of emotion. It was as though she had become one with the void, a creature of pure darkness, a being of unimaginable power. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her, the invisible forces of the universe bending to her will. But despite the power she wielded, despite the godlike control she had over the shadows, something gnawed at her from within. A flicker of doubt, a shard of something she could not place. She had freed the house, had unlocked its true nature, and yet she felt empty. The emptiness that had consumed her, that had twisted her into something new, had not gone away. It had only deepened. The darkness had filled the void inside her, but it had not satisfied it. The power she had unleashed had not brought her the peace she had hoped for. It had not brought her the answers she had so desperately sought. She had become the darkness, but in doing so, she had lost herself. Eleanor's thoughts drifted back to her mother, to the girl she had once been. Before the house, before the darkness, she had been full of dreams, full of hope. She had loved her mother, loved her deeply, even as her mother had slowly slipped away. Her death had been the catalyst, the beginning of everything. She had been so sure, so desperate, to fill the emptiness that had followed. She had thought the house, the power, would fix everything. But now, as she floated in the infinite darkness, she understood that nothing could ever fill that void. Not the house, not the darkness, not even her newfound power. The thought of her father flickered in her mind, and for the first time in what felt like ages, a sharp pang of sorrow gripped her chest. She had left him behind. She had abandoned him to the horrors of the house, to the forces that she had awakened. She hadn't thought about him. Not really. Not since the moment she had entered the house, since the moment the darkness had claimed her. The truth of it hit her like a wave, and her heart felt heavy with regret. But regret was useless now. The darkness had claimed her, and there was no going back. As she drifted further into the blackness, a ripple of energy surged through her, and the void around her began to shift. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor, a shift in the air. But it grew quickly, building, expanding. The darkness seemed to respond to her, like it was reacting to her thoughts. It was alive, breathing with her. But then, something else. A flicker, a movement in the distance. It was faint at first, like the glimmer of a dying star. But it grew brighter, sharper, as if something was pushing its way through the very fabric of the void. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest, her heart beating faster. She could feel it. Something was coming. Something was pushing its way toward her. A whisper cut through the darkness. It was so soft, so faint, that she almost thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, echoing in her mind, vibrating through the very bones of her body. Eleanor. The voice was familiar, yet not. It was the voice of the house, the voice of the entity that had once controlled her, but now it was different. It was more than that. It was the voice of the thing behind the house, the thing that had been waiting all along. You are not the end. The words sent a cold shiver through her. The power that she had once felt so certain of now seemed small in comparison to the force that was rising from the depths of the darkness. You are but a pawn in the greater game. The shadows twisted violently around her, as though responding to the words. The air thickened, charged with an energy she could not comprehend. Eleanor's breath came faster, her body trembling as the realization began to sink in. She had been so sure that she had become the house, that she had unlocked its true nature, freed it from the chains that had bound it for so long. But now, she understood. The house had never been the source of the power. The house had been the vessel. She had been the vessel. There was something greater, something far older, behind it all. And now, it was coming for her. The very fabric of the void began to twist, and Eleanor felt herself being pulled toward something. The darkness that had once been a part of her, something she had controlled, now seemed to slip through her fingers like sand in the wind. It was being sucked away, pulled back into the depths. The space around her seemed to ripple, warping and distorting. Shapes began to form. Shadows that were no longer just shadows, but something else, something more. They stretched and twisted, pulling themselves together into forms she couldn't quite comprehend. Some of them were human, but their faces were distorted, their eyes hollow and empty. Others were monstrous, their shapes so alien that they made her skin crawl. And in the center of it all, something more. A presence, a force, far beyond anything she had ever encountered. It was coming for her. The shadows began to converge on her, tightening around her like a noose. Eleanor fought, instinctively, her hands reaching out, her mind screaming for control. But it was no use. The power she had once commanded was slipping from her grasp. The darkness that had once been hers was now being consumed, sucked away into the depths of the void. And then, in the heart of the darkness, she saw it. A figure, tall and cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by a veil of blackness. It was not human. It was something else, something ancient, something she could not comprehend. Its presence was overwhelming, a force of nature that made her feel as small as a grain of sand. The reckoning has come. The words reverberated through her, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was not the end. It was the beginning, and she was no longer the one who held the power. She was the one being hunted. Chapter 15. The Doll That Moved. Eleanor's heart raced as the presence, the force behind the darkness, began to press in on her from all sides. It was as though the very air around her had become solid, an impenetrable wall that closed in tighter with every breath she took. The shadows around her twisted and writhed like living things, the walls of the void now pulsing with a sickly rhythm that matched the pounding of her own heart. She could no longer see, only feel. Feel the crushing weight of the dark, feel the overwhelming presence that loomed just beyond her reach. It was everywhere, and it was suffocating her. Her hands trembled at her sides, the power she had once held slipping through her grasp like sand through her fingers. The darkness had been hers. She had controlled it, commanded it to obey. But now, it felt alien, foreign, as if it were turning against her, rejecting her. She was no longer the master of the void. She was a prisoner in it. The figure before her shifted, its form expanding, growing larger with each passing second. It moved through the shadows, its presence engulfing everything in its path. Eleanor could feel it coming closer, feel its cold, oppressive touch. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but no sound came. The void had stolen her voice, just as it had stolen everything else from her. The figure's shape became clearer, though still shrouded in darkness. It was towering, its features hidden beneath a cloak of black, its form stretching impossibly tall, like something that had never belonged to this world. It was a creature of the void, of the darkness that Eleanor had awakened, and it was coming for her. You thought you were the end. The voice echoed through her mind, cold and venomous. But you were just the beginning. Eleanor's body trembled as the weight of the words sank in. The force, the entity, was not just speaking to her. It was speaking through her. It was as if the house, the darkness, the power she had unleashed, had all been leading up to this moment. She had thought she was free, free from her pain, free from the house, free from the loss of her mother. But now, she understood. She had never been free. She had always been a pawn in a much larger game. The figure's cloak swirled around it like a cloud of smoke, its shape constantly shifting, its form never fully solid. Eleanor could not tear her eyes away. It was a paradox, a thing of both vast power and unfathomable emptiness. She could feel the abyss staring back at her through its eyes, though she could not see them. It was as if it were looking into her very soul. "You are nothing," it whispered, the words slithering into her mind like poison. "You are nothing but a tool, a vessel." The coldness of its presence seeped into her, a bone-deep chill that made her skin crawl. The darkness wrapped tighter around her, crushing her, suffocating her. Eleanor gasped for air, but the air was thick, heavy, like it had turned to stone. Her body was heavy too, sluggish, as though the weight of the void had pressed against her chest, making it impossible to breathe. The house, the entity, had always been her burden, her curse. She had tried to control it, to mold it into something she could wield, something she could understand. But now, in the face of this overwhelming presence, she realized how small she had been, how naive. Her fingers twitched, and for a fleeting moment, the darkness seemed to respond to her. It pulsed, thrummed with energy, as if acknowledging her presence. But it was too weak. The shadows were no longer hers to command. They had rejected her, abandoned her, and now they fed the creature before her. She was nothing, nothing but a fading echo in the vast emptiness of the void. "You were always meant to serve," the entity crooned, "just as the house served me, just as you will serve me." A terrible understanding washed over Eleanor. The darkness, the house, it had all been a prison. but not for her, for something else, something far older, far more powerful. The entity before her had been waiting for her to unleash it, waiting for her to free it from the confines of the house. And now that it was free, now that it had risen from the depths, there was no stopping it. She had been the instrument of its release. The house had been nothing more than a vessel, a conduit through which it could escape. The house was never hers. It had never been hers to control. And now, it was beyond her, beyond anything she could have imagined. The entity's presence grew stronger, its form more solid, its shape becoming more defined as it loomed before her. It reached out, a long, twisted hand of shadow that stretched impossibly far toward her. Eleanor's legs buckled beneath her as the touch came closer, cold and unyielding, like ice pressed against her skin. She wanted to move, wanted to run, but her body was paralyzed, frozen in place by the overwhelming power of the entity. Its fingers brushed against her skin, sending a wave of pain and cold through her body. It was as if every nerve in her body were on fire, each part of her being torn apart by the touch of its shadowy hand. She could feel herself unraveling, piece by piece, as the darkness poured into her, filling the cracks that had been left by the house, by her mother's death, by everything she had tried to escape. "This is the end," the entity whispered, its voice no longer a distant echo but a solid presence in her mind. "You were never meant to be the master. You were always meant to be the sacrifice." Her vision blurred as her mind began to fracture. She could feel her identity slipping away, lost to the power of the entity that surrounded her. The house had not been her salvation. It had been her undoing. Her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind, spinning out of control as the darkness closed in. The void seemed to consume everything. The last remnants of her humanity, the last traces of the girl she had been before the house, before the darkness. There was no turning back now. There was no escape. The darkness had won, and Eleanor had become nothing more than a shadow, a wisp of the girl she had once been. She had become the very thing she had feared, the vessel through which the entity would destroy the world. As the last fragments of her being faded into nothingness, she felt a flicker of something deep within her, a whisper, a glimmer of hope. But it was too late. The void swallowed it whole, and with it, the last of Eleanor. Chapter 16. What the House Demands. The void had swallowed Eleanor whole, and for a time, there was only darkness, only emptiness. No sound, no light, no sense of time. It was as if she had ceased to exist. Her form dissolved into the very fabric of the darkness that had claimed her. There was nothing left of her, nothing but the hollow echo of her presence reverberating through the endless abyss. But even in the depths of that all-consuming void, something stirred. A flicker, a pulse, a heartbeat, so faint, it could have been mistaken for a mere thought. But it wasn't. The darkness, the shadow that had been her prison, seemed to recoil slightly, as though it recognized the faintest trace of life within it. It was a whisper, a sensation that should not have been possible in a place so absolute, so devoid of anything but oblivion. It was a spark, however small, of something that should not exist here. It was Eleanor. She felt it first as a tremor, a shift in the stillness, as if the very essence of her being were pushing against the boundaries of the void. She couldn't see, but she could sense it. She could feel herself, or what remained of her, struggling to take shape again, struggling to exist. Her thoughts felt disjointed, disconnected from her body, as if they were floating on the edges of her awareness. But she clung to them. They were the last thread tying her to who she had been, before the shadows, before the house, before everything had been consumed by darkness. She was not gone, not entirely. Something deep inside her still fought. The presence that had once towered over her, the entity that had promised her nothing but destruction, was still there, but it felt distant now, weaker. It was as if its grip on her had loosened, allowing some small shred of her to remain. No, she thought, or perhaps she simply felt it. I am not finished. Not yet. The darkness seemed to press in again, suffocating her, but this time, it did not feel as absolute. This time, there was something fighting back. There was something inside her that refused to yield completely, something primal, something human, that refused to be consumed. She clung to it with everything she had, though it felt like holding onto the edge of a cliff while everything beneath her crumbled away. The sensation of her body began to return. It was subtle at first, a flicker of awareness, the faintest pulse of energy, and then it grew stronger. Her limbs tingled. Her chest ached with the effort of drawing air, even though she could not breathe in this place. But the sensation was unmistakable. She was regaining herself. She was coming back. Her eyes snapped open, though they saw nothing. There was only darkness, an infinite black void that stretched on forever, endless and all-encompassing. But Eleanor could feel it now, the weight of the shadows that pressed against her, the silence that threatened to swallow her whole. She was here. She was still here. She could hear the entity, its presence looming in the depths, its voice just on the edge of her consciousness. "You are broken," it whispered, the sound like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, each one cold and hollow. "You cannot escape. You belong to the void." But Eleanor was not listening. She had heard these words before. They had been whispered to her in the darkest corners of her mind, when she had been weak and lost. But now she was different. Something had shifted inside her. A spark, no longer small and fragile, now burned brightly, pushing back against the dark. "I belong to myself," she thought fiercely, the words piercing through the void like a blade through mist. "I will not be your vessel." Her hands trembled at her sides, but they were solid now, no longer the ethereal, insubstantial things they had been in the depths of the darkness. She could feel them, could move them. She could feel the connection to her body, feel the raw pulse of energy that surged within her, a power that had been dormant, buried beneath layers of shadow, but now it flared to life with an intensity that took her breath away. The void around her quaked, rippling in response to her defiance. The shadows seemed to recoil, pulling away from her like something repelled by light. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor could breathe, could feel the air fill her lungs, even if it was not air at all. It was as though the very fabric of the void was bending to her will, twisting and warping as her presence grew stronger. The entity growled, its voice now sharp with frustration, with fury. "You cannot escape this place. You cannot fight me. I have claimed you." "No," she thought again, the word louder now, ringing in her mind with an undeniable force. "You never claimed me. Not truly." For the first time, Eleanor's senses expanded beyond the confines of her own body. She could feel the pulse of the void around her, the endless shadows that swirled in all directions. She could feel the pull of the entity, the way it tried to draw her in. But now she could see it for what it was. It was not a force that could be fought, not in the traditional sense. It was an ancient thing, born of the void, and it fed on the fear, the despair, of those who crossed its path. But Eleanor had something it could not understand, something it could not consume. Hope. It was fragile, fleeting, but it burned within her, and that alone made her a force to be reckoned with. She had felt the darkness try to take her, to claim her as its own, but it had not succeeded. The void had not broken her. It had only made her stronger. She had learned its secrets, tasted its power, but now she was no longer a victim to it. She was something else, something that could walk within its depths without fear. "I will not be your sacrifice," Eleanor thought, her mind sharp with newfound clarity. I am not yours to control." With a sudden burst of force, Eleanor reached out, her hands slicing through the shadows like a knife through fog. The darkness resisted, swirling around her, but she was no longer afraid. She was no longer lost. The void bent to her will, her power now a part of her, a force of its own, carving a path through the darkness, creating space where there had once been only suffocating blackness. The entity roared in fury, its presence flickering like a flame caught in the wind. But Eleanor stood tall. She had no physical form, no true body to fight with, but the energy she now commanded was a force far greater than anything she had ever known. And in that moment, Eleanor knew the truth. She was not just a victim. She was the reckoning. The shadows parted before her, the presence of the entity weakening with each passing second. It was not gone. No, it still lurked in the depths, but Eleanor had learned to stand against it. She had learned to fight the darkness with the very thing it could not destroy, her own light. And with that, she took her first step into the unknown. This time, she would not be consumed. Chapter 17. The Final Room. The air around Eleanor was thick with tension, a palpable pressure that pressed against her skin like an invisible hand. The shadows still clung to her, their cold fingers curling and twisting around her limbs, but they no longer held the same power over her. The void was vast, its depth seemingly infinite, yet Eleanor felt a strange, almost comforting sense of control. She had come to understand it, to recognize its patterns, to see through its illusions. The darkness no longer scared her. It was simply another part of her, an extension of the force she now wielded. In the distance, beyond the shifting blackness, she could feel the entity watching her. It was still there, lurking just outside her reach, its presence like a dark cloud hanging overhead. But it was not the same as before. The oppressive weight that had once filled the space, smothering everything with its cold grasp, had lessened. Now, it was as if the entity was recoiling, retreating into the depths, unable to draw her back into its suffocating embrace. Eleanor's breath, or what passed for it in this place, was steady. Her senses were sharp, every detail of the void now within her grasp. She could feel the walls of the abyss, the pulse of the darkness, the faint echoes of 1,000 lost souls. It was all within her reach, all waiting to be shaped and molded. She could feel the very essence of the house, its ancient, decaying foundation, still rooted deep within the blackness. But she no longer feared it. She understood it now. She was a part of it, as much as it was a part of her. "I am no longer the girl you sought to consume," she thought, her mind cutting through the void like a blade through fog. "I am something more, something stronger." The entity responded with a ripple through the shadows, a pulse of energy that crackled through the air. It was not a roar, not a scream, but a sound that resonated deep within her bones, a low, rumbling growl that reverberated like thunder. It was the sound of frustration, of rage. It was a sound that made the very air around her tremble. "You cannot defeat me," the entity whispered, its voice like the scrape of claws on stone. "I am eternal. I have seen worlds fall. You are nothing but a fleeting shadow, a brief flicker of defiance. You cannot win." Eleanor's eyes, though they had no true form, narrowed with focus. The entity's words were hollow, empty echoes that carried no weight. She had already won. She had already taken the first step in breaking its grip on her. The house, the darkness, it all no longer held sway over her. She was not the same girl who had stumbled into the house, grieving and lost. She was something else, something forged in the depths of the void itself. "I don't need to defeat you," she replied, her thoughts sharp and unyielding. "I just need to set myself free." The shadows seemed to pulse at her words, as if recoiling from the sheer force of her resolve. The entity's presence faltered for a moment, just long enough for Eleanor to push forward, to take another step deeper into the heart of the void. She could feel it now, the remnants of the house that had once trapped her. The walls, the rooms, the corridors, they were still here, still a part of this place, their remnants lingering in the darkness like forgotten memories. Her hands stretched out, and she could feel them, feel the presence of the house that had once been her prison. But now, it was not the house she had known. It was an echo, a memory, a reflection of what had once been. The entity had shaped it, molded it into something dark and terrifying, but it had not been the source of her torment. No, that had been her own doing. She had called the darkness to her. She had opened the door to the void, and now she would close it. Eleanor's fingers, though insubstantial, brushed against the remnants of the walls, feeling the decay, the rot that had set in over the years. It was a familiar sensation, but it no longer held the same weight. She was no longer afraid of it. The shadows seemed to writhe and recoil at her touch, as if they could feel her defiance, her power. They had once held her in their grip, but now she was the one who controlled them. "You cannot banish me," the entity hissed, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You are mine. This place is mine. You cannot escape." Eleanor closed her eyes, though there was nothing to see. She could feel the pull of the entity, feel its power trying to draw her back into the darkness. But it was weaker now, fainter. She could feel the void bending to her will, the shadows twisting in ways they never had before. She was no longer a pawn in its game. She was the player. "I will escape," she thought, her voice unwavering, even in the face of the entity's threats. "And I will leave you behind." The darkness seemed to wail in response, a high-pitched sound that echoed through the void like a dying scream. But Eleanor's resolve was unshaken. She focused on the house, on the faint memories of the walls, the rooms, the spaces that had once been her home. She could feel them, faint traces of the house she had known, lingering in the edges of the darkness. They were still there, still anchored to the void, waiting to be reawakened. With a surge of effort, Eleanor reached out again, her thoughts reaching into the heart of the void, into the very fabric of the shadows that had once consumed her. She focused on the remnants of the house, the foundation that had once been her prison, and she pulled. She pulled with everything she had, using the power of the void, the power she had claimed, to tear the shadows apart, to break the grip the entity had on her. The void screamed, a deafening sound that shook the very core of the darkness. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, their forms distorted, as if they were trying to fight back, to hold onto their hold over her. But it was futile. Eleanor was stronger now. She was no longer a child who had stumbled into this place. She was the darkness, and she was the light. She was both, and neither. With one final, explosive push, Eleanor tore through the void, breaking the chains that had once bound her. The house, the darkness, the entity, all of it began to unravel, the shadows dissipating into the void, leaving only silence in their wake. Eleanor stood alone in the emptiness, her breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. She could still feel the remnants of the shadows around her, the echoes of the entity, but they were fading now. She had won. The entity, once so powerful, had been forced to retreat, vanishing into the void from which it had come. For the first time since she had entered the house, Eleanor felt truly free. But the freedom was bittersweet. The void had not been defeated. It was still there, lingering at the edges of her mind, waiting, and she knew, deep down, that the battle was far from over. The reckoning had only just begun. Chapter 18. Eternally Waiting. The air around Eleanor was still, but not in the peaceful way it once had been. No, it was the kind of stillness that seeped into the bones, the kind that pressed down with an unseen weight, like a secret waiting to be revealed. The darkness had receded, but it had not disappeared. It lingered, a shadow of something that had once been all-consuming, now scattered and broken. Yet, something about it felt different. Something that had once been all-consuming, relentless, was now subdued. She had emerged from the abyss, or so it seemed. She was free, or at least it felt that way. The void that had surrounded her for so long no longer held its suffocating grip. The entity, its presence, had been vanquished, or so she believed. But Eleanor knew better. The house had crumbled. Its walls were no more than dust now, and the rooms that had once imprisoned her were empty, hollow shells. It was a place of silence now, and silence, in its own way, was just as terrifying as the screams that had once filled its halls. The house had been her battleground, but now it was nothing more than a forgotten relic, a fading memory. The dark power that had once pulsed within its very foundation was no longer a threat. It had been dissolved, broken apart by her own hands. Yet, Eleanor could not shake the sense that something was still there. Something was watching. A faint whisper, almost imperceptible, brushed against her mind like a soft breath, a thread of sound too quiet to place. She could not tell where it was coming from, but she could feel it in her blood, in the pulse of her heart. It was as though the very fabric of the world around her had been stitched with invisible threads, and something on the other side was pulling at them, slowly, quietly, but with growing intensity. For a moment, she hesitated. Her eyes, though they were no more than shadows in the endless void, flickered. There was something deep within her, telling her that this was not truly the end. Not yet. The silence stretched on, and she stood alone in the emptiness. The shadows had no form anymore, but they were still there. She could sense them, still clinging to the edges of the world, barely perceptible but undeniably present. They were waiting for something, waiting for her. She exhaled, though there was no air here, only the faintest hum of power that resonated within her. Eleanor had never felt more alive. Her body, once so weak, once so fragile, now felt strong, brimming with a raw, untamed force. The power she had discovered within herself had become her constant companion, something that thrummed beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. She was no longer just a girl. She was something beyond that now, something shaped by darkness but not controlled by it. She was the reckoning, the storm that had risen from the ashes of her own despair. Yet, she knew that with power came a price. The house had tried to claim her, to make her its own. The entity had sought to break her, to mold her into something it could control. And in a sense, it had succeeded. But Eleanor had fought back. She had taken back what had once been hers. But there was something darker still, something she could not fully understand. The entity may have retreated, but its influence had left scars upon her soul, deep scars that would not easily fade. She could feel them, these unseen marks, shifting beneath the surface of her thoughts. They were not fully gone. Not yet. The faint whisper came again, this time stronger. Eleanor could hear it clearer now, though its source remained elusive. It was a voice, soft and seductive, brushing against her consciousness like a velvet touch. "You think you have won, Eleanor?" it whispered, each word a caress, "but you are not free. You are mine. You always have been." Her heart skipped a beat, but her resolve did not falter. The voice was familiar. It was the entity, or perhaps it was something else, something older, something that had always been there, just beneath the surface of her mind. It was a part of her now, just as she had once been a part of it. The line between them had blurred, and the power she had fought so hard to claim had come with a cost. Eleanor clenched her fists, her breath steady despite the weight of the words that lingered in her mind. "No," she thought, her voice firm despite the tremors beneath it. "I am not yours. I never was." The whisper faltered, the darkness around her rippling like a disturbed pool of water. But it did not vanish. It lingered, shifting, pulling, testing her resolve. "You think you can fight me," it whispered again, "but I am part of you. I always have been." Eleanor closed her eyes. She could feel the weight of its words, the truth in them, and yet she refused to yield. The darkness had become a part of her, but it was not her. It was a part of the house, a part of the void, a part of the entity that had sought to break her. She had conquered it, yes, but she could never truly erase it. Not completely, but she could control it. Eleanor extended her arms before her, feeling the darkness swirl around her, its cold fingers brushing against her skin like a lover's touch. She could feel its power, its weight, but it no longer had the hold it once did. It was no longer her master. She was its master now. She reached deep within herself, feeling the pulse of the shadows, the energy that flowed through her veins. She had learned how to command the dark, how to bend it to her will. It was no longer something to fear. It was her strength. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but Eleanor did not flinch. She had faced the abyss and emerged stronger for it. She had faced the entity and cast it out. Now, she was not afraid of the dark. She had become it. With a final, decisive motion, she extended her hand into the shadows. The darkness seemed to bend and writhe at her touch, but it did not fight her. Instead, it surrendered, folding into her like a wave crashing against the shore, only to be pulled back in, consumed by the force that she now commanded. The whisper faded, the voice dissolving into nothingness. The shadows fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the stillness. And then, in the distance, something shifted. A presence. A flicker of light in the farthest reaches of the void. Eleanor turned toward it, her body moving with a fluidity that was both natural and unnatural. She could feel it, this faint presence, like a pulse against the fabric of the darkness. It was distant, but it was there. It was a spark of something, something new, something that had not been there before. It was then that she understood. The void was not gone. The shadows were not gone. They would never be gone. But she had learned to live with them, to shape them, to control them. The house, the entity, the darkness. It had all been a part of her journey. But now, she was something different. She was not the girl who had entered this place. She was not the girl who had lost herself in the shadows. She was the reckoning. And with that, the darkness that had once consumed her faded, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence. She was free, yes, but she was never truly alone. The shadows would always be with her. And in that, she had found her peace. Her journey had ended, but its echoes would last forever. And in the silence, there was only her, only Eleanor. The final whisper had been her own,